Now we have music. Okay, so I'm going to do a really brief presentation. Some of this is taken from a workshop that I teach at URISA that is about 8 hours of time. Actually, it's about a 10-hour workshop, but we usually give it in about 8 hours. So this is going to be the speed talk version, but part of this is, in terms of what is a best practice in terms of assigning addresses and maintaining addresses. I'm going to go through this really fairly quickly for you. So bear with me as we do that. What is addressing about? It's a location identification system, and we use it for a lot of different purposes. Obviously, mail and package delivery, locating things, emergencies, disasters, services, navigation, lots of things get used, and addresses are sort of the ubiquitous thing. We all know our own address. People don't know their parcel ID or their account numbers for things, but they do know that. Addresses are local in nature, and their addressing is a function of local government across the United States. It is vested in the local governments, which means as they would say, the lowest level, which I think is actually the highest level, the towns, the cities. If there is not an operative town or city in the county government, but that's the level at which addressing is done. And it seems to have remained a mystery at the federal level, because at some point they thought all the states had a full list of all the addresses in every state. And they were disabused of that notion by the states real fast. So it's a local thing. And they've been assigned over a long period of time, not always consistently, as you are finding out. And what's right in one jurisdiction may be wrong in another jurisdiction. We find jurisdictions right next to each other who have, some of them have the even numbers on the right side as the numbers increase. Some of them have them on the left side. There's not a right and wrong. The issue is to be consistent and to follow a discernible pattern, because what you're aiming for, and the thing that I always keep in my head, is if I'm standing in the middle of a town, the middle of Los Angeles, and I've never been there before, and I'm trying to find a specific address, the addresses have to be logically organized. If they're just random numbers, there's no way you're going to be able to know where that number specifically that you're looking for is going to be found. If they go in order, 2, 4, 6, 8, or 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, you can find it. So usually a jurisdiction, say a city or county, or a portion of a community, has a specific discernible pattern. And what you want to do is figure out what that pattern is. It was probably done before you ever came on the scene. There've probably been a number of people who've manipulated it over the years, but it is a thing. And the times when it doesn't work is when you don't apply it consistently. We had one jurisdiction where we found the number 1 on a street somewhere in the middle of the 1400s. That's not consistent. When you've patched it inadequately or inconsistently over time, when it's based on some other system like parcel numbering, and the thing that happens there is parcel numbering doesn't need to be logically organized. So the surveyor just kind of goes around and around and around and puts numbers on lots. And you wind up with number 1 being across the street from number 265. And the odd and even isn't maintained. Parcel numbering, coordinate values, other invisible metrics really don't work very well. And what you want to say is, can a person walking or driving through this area understand the system based on the visible street sign names and the logic of the numbering, find the approximate location of a specific address? So it works as a navigation system, and it's logical because streets are named. There's often a pattern to the naming. The names are visible on the landscape. There are street signs. Structures are numbered. The numbers are organized in some kind of numeric order. The numbers are visible on the structures, address numbers, or they're often called house numbers. And the numbering and naming patterns have been consistently applied throughout the area. So that's when we went to develop a standard for address data for the United States. And Ed and I are both co-authors of that, along with a lot of other people, but we had a pretty major role in it. We refer to this as an address reference system. And we've documented that in the federal address standard that Federal Geographic Data Committee put out. It's published, and there's a link for it in here. And I will be happy to give you this set of, can distribute them because I know this is pretty quick. But the address reference system describes the business rules that each one of you as a local jurisdiction uses or has used to assign addresses. There's about 3 types that we found in the United States. One is the grid with 100 blocks all neat and laid out in rectangles or squares. There are the linear versions that begin a street and just keep numbering it till it ends. Those are used in a lot of areas with very difficult terrain. You look at counties up in the mountains in the Rockies or in the Sierras, the streets run along the contour lines, not in any grid pattern. And that's what we call a linear pattern or a non-axial pattern. There are a few that are area-based where numbers are assigned kind of randomly, but usually within a pretty small area. Each one of these has some common components that describe the rules that you use for assigning and for doing quality control. And the codifying this into the standard was really a product of looking at quality control for addresses. How do you tell if this address is correctly placed and follows the rules? And the person who was working on that at the time called me up and said, Martha, how do I know whether the odd numbers belong on the odd side, on the left side or the right side of the street? We have to know what the rule is before we can tell you whether it's in the right place or not. And I had one of those moments of, well, duh. Yes, of course you need to know what the rules are first. So it's really important for quality to be able to know what the rules are, because you build your quality testing around the rules. So all those rules are local, and what you have in one town is probably not the same as what your neighbors have next door to some degree. And here's a basic description of those 3 types that we just talked about, and I won't go through that again.
Hey, Martha.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt, but I just want to make sure you're aware that you're sharing our the speaker view, and we can see.
Oh, okay.
Slides there, which is fine, but I just want to make sure you got what you wanted out of this.
It's fine with me.
Okay.
Unfortunately, I hate to interrupt and go back to figure out how to move it over to the other screen I've got.
No problem.
Let's see. Okay. So, looking at, well, when was your community addressed, and what do you know about what do you know about that, and what are some of the observable features you can see? We refer to that as forensic address discovery. And you go back and you stare at your maps and you look at them and you figure this out, and you start writing down the things that look like they're consistently made rules in your system, and figure out where they came from. You may have documentation for that. The streets are your base. Generally, things are organized around the pattern of the street network, whatever you got. Areas with a grid, areas that have linear descriptions because of topographic features, along the edges of rivers, lakes, mountains, other types of things like that. So identifying your street network and cleaning up your street network is the first critical step in getting to good addressing. Best practice, make sure every segment has a name, make sure every segment connects to all the other segments of a road that has the same name. Be sure everything, clean up the geometry and clean up the organization and the naming. We find a lot of inconsistency where names are applied to individual street segments, and it might be St. James Street, and in some places it's ST period, some places it's ST, some places it's SAINT. Humans know that those all mean the same thing, but the computer doesn't, and getting that stuff cleaned up is really the first step that you want to go through in cleaning up and organizing your address data. It can take a surprisingly large amount of time. How are your streets organized? Are there themes? Do you use directionals like north, south, east, and west, or northwest, southwest, etc.? Do you require, as a number of cities in the state of Washington require their streets to only be done with numbers? They don't allow names for streets, so to speak, or other things, other words. Are there things that you prohibit? Are there things that you don't allow? As a best practice, do not allow duplicate names, including the suffix. So don't allow Elm Street and Elm Way and Elm Court. People forget that suffix when they're calling in an emergency, and it can cause a lot of confusion. Do the names run for the distance of the street? What happens if there are breaks in the, a block gets cut off and you have the same street on either side? There's a lot of rules like that that you want to identify, because going forward, you want to perpetuate those rules. You want to continue those rules as you're going forward, or change them if they really don't work for you. Street names consistently recorded, spelling, punctuation. Again, the directionals, are they all there? Are the street types consistent? Does every segment of a given street use the same type? Again, sorting out duplicate names. Duplicate names cause dispatching, bad dispatching. And I know you see it in your newspapers there, just as we see it here. The police went to the wrong place and conducted a drug raid on some little 99-year-old grandmother who doesn't know aspirin from ibuprofen. It's just, you don't want to have those things happen. So, get rid of the duplicate names, look at consistency, look at cleaning up that street network. Following that, you want to create the master street name list. That often takes a while as well. And many streets have multiple names. And some are official, some aren't, but you often have county road numbers or letters. You have state route and federal route numbers, a local name, and sometimes commonly used abbreviations. So getting all of those things and saying, for each segment of road in your street centerline network, what name or names are used for that particular segment, and how does that work? Often a route number will occur on more than one street. We have a case in DC with Route 50, US Route 50, where it's on New York Avenue, it's on 14th Street as it crosses the district. But not all of New York Avenue and not all of 14th Street are in fact Route 50. So you have to it's got to be done segment by segment. And this is also a quality thing that often takes a lot of time to straighten out, but you can't really figure out your addressing system until you've done that. Street names, here's just some suggestions of rules. What can you use? Sound-alike rules: 4th Street, the number 4th, F-O-U-R-T-H, and Fort Street, like Fort McHenry. Fort and 4th often can be confused, especially if somebody does not speak clearly when they're making an emergency call. Names that you want to prohibit, names that are offensive, names that we've been having a lot of discussion lately of names of Confederate heroes in the South and whether streets should have those names. And some of them are being changed. Other names can be offensive. Brand names can be a problem. If you decide to call the road leading to the Home Depot Street, and all of a sudden it becomes a Lowe's, Lowe's isn't going to be happy, nor is Home Depot about that. And you're going to have to be changing the names. So those are kind of things you might want to think about, whether you use numbered or named streets or a combination. Streets that aren't continuous, what happens when a street changes direction, length of names. Does your sign shop have a limit on the number of characters? What about words that are not English or Spanish? And use of type words like lane or park or court, or the directionals like north as a part of the street name itself. Park Lane Circle is a street that actually exists in a town that I used to live in. And that can be confusing because any of those could be a street type as well as a street name. So those are things to think about in your rules. You want to document those rules as much as you can as you go forward. So those are a couple of things to think about. Street types and directionals and modifiers. You may have rules about what some people associate a specific prefix or suffix type with a type of road. In other words, arterials may only have these types. Cul-de-sacs can be called court. They can't be called anything but a court or a, something like that. what types do you allow? What types do you not allow? The US Postal Service in publication 28 has a list of about 215. It varies, it goes up and down time to time, of types that they recognize along with abbreviations for them. And you might want to take a look. I've never seen anybody who uses more than about 25 or 30 types in general, but you can look at it and see what you have. Again, directionals, are they required? Are they optional? Are they prohibited? Do you use what I call cardinal directions, just plain north, south, east, and west, or a quadrant? Some people divide their city into quadrants, and each quadrant has to have its designator with it. Washington, D.C. is one of those. It's pretty normal. I mean, you have to have a quadrant in D.C. because streets cross the lines between the street crosses the line of the quadrant. So you might have 4th Street Northeast and 4th Street Northwest, and the numbers would be duplicated on those. So the quadrant designator is terrifically important there. Direction, you can prohibit them, you can use them, you can make them optional. And do they occur before or after the street name and type, or either place, or sometimes both? And modifiers are words that come kind of on the outer edge of a street name, like Old North Main Street or Main Street Extended. Those extended or old. Do you allow that to happen? And do you want it before the street name, or do you want it at the end of the street name, or both? So those are things to think about in terms of the rules with street names. Okay, numbering gets a little more interesting. Here's the very simple pattern. These are what the numbers are in sequence, odd numbers on one side, even numbers on the other side, and they are allocated with a metric kind of thing. So the buildings in the lighter color, there are actually vacant properties, but they still have a placeholder number for them. You don't just put 12 on the next building that comes along, you put it where it belongs metrically. This is one where there's no block break, which means at the cross street, the numbers just simply continue here from 20 to 22. Here's one where you break at the 100 block, and some people do this. And this particular jurisdiction assigns theirs as every 10 numbers, again, leaving placeholders for vacant, where we have a vacant property in here. And then at the block break, at the intersection, it goes from what we call the unit block, which has it's less than 99, to the 100 block, and then on to the 200 block at the next intersection. So that's a patterning that you can think about. You want to look at things like, if this was a 3-way intersection rather than a 4-way intersection, would you break the block there and start the new 100 series or not? That can be a factor if you have a lot of alleys, because the alley often is not considered to break a block, even if it crosses at that point. So question, sequential or consecutive? Consecutive numbers are like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's no space in between them, and you've not left any space. Sequential, like the second drawing we just looked at, the next building in that series was always 10 numbers higher than the one before it. They're still in a sequence. The numbers continue to go up in a recognizable pattern, but the interval went from 2 in the first image to 10 in the second. And in some cases, you base it on a distance or a metric that might be there. Is that, how far apart of the buildings do you want to leave space for additional buildings that may come in between? You definitely want to think about leaving space, because if you have no number available, if you do the consecutive numbering with no space, and then somebody comes along and puts something in between, you can have a real problem with that. So again, look at your rules, look at what you see from the data you have, and define and discern your rules based on that. Somebody have a question?
10:30 right now. That I don't know.
I think it's just somebody didn't put themselves on mute.
Okay, I've got about 5 or 6 more slides here. So, discern how your community was addressed by how the numbers work. Is it consistent? Do you find find where there are places where there are breaks. Everybody will find what we refer to as anomalies, things that don't meet your rules. Don't write your rules to be so elastic that you don't really have a rule. Make the rule for the 95% and look at the 5% that's left over that really doesn't make sense, like the number 1 in the middle of the 1400 series, and say, you know, what can we do to fix that? Or how should we fix that? Blocks and ranges, we'll talk about, you can usually find that if you look at your MSAG data in your 911 stuff, or just again by looking at how the breaks work as you go. Again, parity, which side has odd numbers, which sides had even numbers, and are you consistent across your entire jurisdiction? And where do numbers start? Again, is there a single point of beginning? Washington, D.C., that point of beginning is located in the basement of your United States Capitol. There's a stone there that shows it, a marker, brass marker. And they start at 0 right there at the Capitol building. But other places start, the city of Berkeley starts at the northwest corner out in the bay and works south and east. Minnesota by convention starts at the southeast corner and works north and west with their numbering in counties. It varies from, you know, so where do you start? And does each street start at that beginning point or line with the number 1, or is there an arbitrary number? And Fairfax County, in order to make all addresses kind of consistent, Fairfax, Virginia, big county here in Northern Virginia, numbered everybody with a 5-digit number. So the starting number in all of their streets is 10,000. They just went to a 5-digit number. There were too many people who wanted 1 or 2-digit numbers because they thought it added prestige and value to their property. And they said, so everybody's getting a 5-digit number, no matter what. And that resolved a lot of 1-point addresses that were out of consistency with the scheme. Subaddresses is something you may want to get to depending on your land use patterns. These are addresses that uniquely identify spaces within a building that has more than 1 occupancy, or a group of buildings, perhaps a campus of a university, or a group of warehouses, or a shopping mall. Sometimes these are referred to as 3D addresses because they often occur in high-rise buildings, but it allows you, if you have a building with 100 apartments in it on 10 floors, to identify when a call is coming in an emergency, which unit within that building and approximately where in the building it might be, which allows your emergency responders to get there faster and more accurately, and saves time, which saves lives. So some people some communities are using it. Some are saying we're not really there yet. We don't have enough big buildings, apartment complexes, shopping malls, those kinds of things. We're not ready to do that. As a recommendation, if you do nothing else, get at least 1 address for every building you have and every property you have done first, and then go back through and look at where you need subaddresses and work through those in a prioritized way. Get the big stuff, the stuff with people living in it, high occupancy stuff, and get that done. Places with a lot of traffic, like big shopping malls and so on, theaters, other complexes with multiple users, because that's where you're going to have the largest volume of emergency calls and first responder needs. You want to include your place names and rules as to what can be used and what can't be used. In your data structure, you want to tie that back to some domains of value to help maintain your data quality. The rules become both spatial and tabular in this process. In other words, is this address point within my spatial jurisdiction? And it's a point and polygon question for you GIS folks. But is this, you might look at, is this a valid community name in the address reference system that you're operating? So if you are Los Angeles County, Rachel has 88 city names that are valid community names within her address reference system. But for those of you who are in a city or a town, your town name is probably the only value that you want to have in that community name field or that place name field that you have. So it's another way to check your data and make sure that you're not holding data that isn't really valid for you in your system. Again, quality matters here. So there's some other things to think about. Many of you will think about this as you go through it. What does the address represent? Is it the center of a parcel? Is it a building centroid? Is it the front door where the driveway leaves the road or the access road is located? And you may want to have points for more than one of these things, particularly where you have a driveway that leaves a public road and may serve 2 or 3 houses that are a half a mile back up into the woods or up over the top of a hill. Big estates, big rural properties. I know LA is an urban area, and I have been to Los Angeles, but you may have places where you want to have both of those things. Commercial property, you may want to have the front door entrance, but you may also want to have a different address, which is where goods and services are delivered to that shopping mall from the backside, and it may come off of a different road and need a specific address, because you don't want the 18-wheeler rolling up to the front door of the mall or the fancy office building and trying to deliver crates of furniture and or pallets of paper for the copying machines. So you might want to document all of that. So the guidance for address system rules and a lot more of what I've been talking about here is found in the Federal Geographic Data Committee standard, the section, and I noted the pages there, pages 186 to 225. So as you can see, there's quite a lot of stuff talking about address reference systems and how they work and what rules can be incorporated. The standard itself contains definitions for all of these components, a lot of attributes that help you work with them and ways to identify addresses that are out of sync. It also contains, for those of you who haven't looked at it, quality tests for address data, along with pseudocode and other information on how to test your addresses systematically. You don't want to try to just gaze at the map and see that you can find errors. You really want to look for places where things don't work properly. And that will give you some guidance on doing that. Just quickly, consistency matters. People need logic to find things. And so look for the patterns, document them, expect to find anomalies, and then remember that addressing works because it's logical and consistent and visible on the landscape. And as a best practice, don't look at changing very many addresses. I think we generally, when we go through even fairly large jurisdictions, the number of addresses that really need to be changed from a public safety point of view is less than 5%. And only change them if in the determination you make and in working with your public safety people, they look at it and say, we can't, based on that address, we could not find it where it actually is. It just doesn't make any sense. Number one, between 1411 and 1413 just doesn't tell us anything about where it is, because we're going to be looking for it down there between 0 and 3. And that's 14 blocks away. So think about how to look at that stuff. Because addresses have been being done for so long, and a lot of people get put in positions to do that work without a lot of training, you're going to get inconsistencies. And look at them and see, can you live with them? Is there a safety problem? And what do you really need to change? And what do you just want to mark in your database? We know this is not it's not in the right place, or we know it's not quite right, but we're aware of it and we know how to manage it. And then you don't spend your time trying to sort it out every single time it comes around. And then finally, just document what you've got. What area is covered, who has the jurisdiction, are there official documents that contain your rules, like an ordinance in your development ordinance, your subdivision regulations, your zoning, or other administrative regs, and then publish them out, including your street name list. So say you can't reuse these street names, but give them a list. Don't make it a mystery that they have to guess. And be reminded that address data is fairly complex. It really needs to be put into a spatially enabled relational database linked to a GIS for display. And it needs to have a maintenance application that helps with assignment updates and doing your quality control testing. And that's pretty much it. Very quickly, here's our email. Feel free to email if you have questions. We're happy to answer them, particularly if it relates to the standard. And we'd be happy to answer your questions for a few more minutes. We have to get off of here in about 5 minutes.
Awesome. Thank you guys. That was an amazing presentation. But yeah, if you guys could send the slides, I could post them to our site. Does